Have you ever heard from your own family that you've already lived too long? Have you ever felt as if every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every silent tear shed for those you love had simply been erased, as if it had no value? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I was sitting at the dinner table in my own home, surrounded by the people who should have protected me the most. And suddenly, those words cut into my soul like a knife. She's lived too long. Send her to the basement. Have you ever been through this? In that instant, time seemed to stand still. The room fell silent, but inside me the noise was deafening. The cold voice that spoke those words wasn't a stranger's, wasn't someone who barely knew me. It was my own daughter-in-law's, the woman I'd accepted as a daughter. And worst of all, my son, the boy I held in my arms, the man who was supposed to be my support in my old age, lowered his head and didn't say a word in my defense. You know that feeling of abandonment, as if the ground had fallen away beneath your feet? I felt it. I dedicated my entire life to that family. I worked as a seamstress for decades, my hands scarred by needles and thread, my body weary from so many hours bent over the fabric. I did it to give my son an education, so he could have a dignified life, so he would never have to endure the hardships I faced. I did what every mother and grandmother does without hesitation. I sacrificed my dreams for theirs. And in the end, when the weight of the years fell upon me, they treated me like an old piece of furniture taking up space. Have you ever felt that way, discarded by your own family? Being a grandmother should be synonymous with respect, wisdom, and heartfelt stories. But at that dinner, I realized that in their minds, I was no longer the keeper of memories, nor the voice of experience. I was simply someone who didn't contribute financially, someone they considered a burden. My daughter-in-law's words echoed in my head like a cruel sentence. The rooms are for those who contribute. Old women don't need comfort. The tears fell silently, but I didn't let them turn into screams. I swallowed the pain silently. Inside me, there was a struggle between humiliation and a strength that still resisted. Because one thing was certain, no matter how hard they pushed me into the basement, no one could erase my story. That night, as they carried my mattress down the stairs, each step felt like a blow to my dignity. The basement was cold, damp, and the air smelled of abandonment. As I packed my clothes into an old suitcase, I thought of all the times I'd stayed up sewing my son's school uniform, the nights I'd skipped meals so he'd have enough on his plate, the times I'd endured body aches and pains and never complained, because that's what being a mother is all about, enduring. And yet, there I was, being treated like someone who was no longer good for anything. I wept silently, hidden in that darkness, but at the same time, something inside me began to stir. A flame, still small, began to burn. Because if they thought my life was over, that I no longer had a voice, that my presence was disposable, they were deeply mistaken. And it was in that heavy silence that something began to shift inside me. I didn't yet know how or when, but I sensed that this story wouldn't end in that basement. Because, even amidst the pain, a part of me knew that fate had another twist in store, and that one day, everyone in that house would realize the weight of the choices they'd made. My name is Dorothy Williams. I'm 72 years old, and even after everything I've been through, I still hold on to the dream of a home filled with love. I've always believed that a true home isn't built with walls or bricks, but with care, respect, and presence. Perhaps that's why I've clung so tightly to the idea of family, even when life took almost everything from me. I lost my husband too soon. He was the only man I ever loved, and his absence left such a deep void that for many years I thought I'd never breathe again. But when Michael was born, I found the strength to carry on. He became my world, my reason to wake up each morning, my silent pride. I worked as a seamstress all my life, night and day, with calloused hands and tired eyes, but with a heart full of hope. I did everything to ensure my son lacked for nothing. Every stitch in the fabric was also a stitch in the construction of a better future for him. I declined invitations, stopped resting, hoarded coins like someone who treasures them, because I knew every detail of that struggle had a purpose. And that purpose was always Michael. When he needed a new uniform for school, I spent entire nights sewing without complaint. When his shoes started to get too tight, I mended and adjusted them until I could afford another pair. My life was made of small choices, but each one carried an enormous weight. The decision to sacrifice myself so that he could have more. I remember the times my neighbors would ask me why I didn't get married again, why I didn't think about myself. But I never wanted to. It wasn't for lack of opportunities, but because I knew my heart was already completely occupied. I had a commitment to my son, and it was as if the whole world fit within that commitment. It was a lonely journey, yes, but it was also a journey of purpose. I believed that one day, every sacrifice would be recognized. There were nights when I cried in secret, not because I regretted it, but because the weight of responsibility seemed too great. Still, I always got back up. There was a quiet strength within me, the kind only a widowed mother knows. The mixture of fear and courage that drives us when there's no other option but to carry on. I had a firm mindset. Nothing, absolutely nothing, would make me give up on giving Michael what he deserved. He grew up amidst all these sacrifices. He was a sweet, polite boy, and I constantly heard from people, "Dorothy, you're lucky, this boy is going to be a great man." And I believed it wholeheartedly. I invested not only money in him, because in truth, there was almost none, but time, love, and teachings. I wanted him to grow up understanding the value of gratitude, empathy, and dignity. And, in a way, I believed I was succeeding. I remember simple moments, but for me they were truly momentous. His first day at school, when he held my hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. The day he brought me a drawing, telling me I was his hero. The proud look on his face when he got his first A. And I, exhausted, felt like the richest woman in the world just seeing that smile. These memories still live within me like small beacons in the darkness. They remind me of who I was and how hard I fought. It's strange to think how life can change so abruptly. Sometimes it seems like fate places us before difficult trials, just to test our resilience. I always thought that, after so many years of struggle, there would be peace. That I would finally receive recognition. Emily no longer looked at me, and that I would grow old surrounded by affection. The impact of that morning, hearing my grandchildren's laughter on the table, and feeling proud of the decisions in her every gesture. But in practice, there was a mixture of discomfort and helplessness, don't always as if she'd lost control of the narrative she tried to impose. Perhaps that's why, when I hear stories from other women, other grandmothers, slowly trying to get closer. I feel a hidden truth that few have the courage to admit on the day of the revelation. Those who receive the most from us are also those who hurt us the most. And while it was so difficult for him to face everything he'd allowed to happen, mothers and grandmothers, I knew the experience had left deep scars, waiting for a call. It was as if he were faced with a new opportunity to rethink his own decisions. And looking back, to rebuild my journey has always been marked by invisible sacrifices. Sarah continued to be my greatest source of joy. No one sees. Every hug from her, many saw every drawing she proudly showed me, was living proof that even amidst wounds, difficult choices, always room to plant scars that never truly teaching her small sewing all stitches, in the name of a love hearing her laughter as she played in the yard, would be eternal, made me feel that the legacy I would leave behind would not be life has a curious way of showing us that what we give doesn't always come back the same way. I understood a lesson that became the guiding thread that began to change everything inside me. No one can erase a story built with true sacrifice without me having any control over what would come next. Even push it into oblivion. It seemed like a slight sensation, but there are things that endure, almost imperceptible, that take root so like deeply that they become unbreakable. My life, gradually, with all its behind-the-scenes sacrifice Emily, and struggle, my daughter-in-law, was among these began to subtly demonstrate that my presence was no longer welcome. Never fails. At first, it was just casual ingratitude, inevitably that tone that seems casual but carries evident in Emily. A hint despite having impossible to ignore, she so desperately your mother takes up too much space. Increasingly isolated within her own home. Echoed in my head. Her victory was an illusion. I pretended not to hear. Because there is no true victory when it stems from injustice. Myself with some task to avoid prolonging the awkward silence. On the other hand, but inside me, each word fell like a stone, isn't immediate, heavy and hard. Not always visible to the eye, how life changes little by little. It arrives without us even realizing recognition. A word changes in attitude there, hugs that carry regret. You find yourself in a strange place. My life has taught me that power surrounded by looks that are no longer affectionate, but impermanent, but judgmental. Staying true to who you always prided myself on being the foundation built with so much effort. Began to feel like I was becoming my voice to prove anything. This impact washed over me silently, calmly and firmly. I tried to convince myself that the roots of that house were always mine. Emily was just stressed, and when someone tries to tear up such deep roots, but deep down all they achieve is to discover the changes were already happening. This understanding. I remember remembered the long work I hadn't felt, the dedication to raising a child alone. Every morning I wake up in my renovated bedroom that had always every afternoon I spend sewing in my studio, faced with those every moment with Sarah. It seemed all of that was worthless. However, it was as if my story, also my entire journey, could be erased. New beginnings only exist when we choose not to let ourselves between what I had offered and what I now received. If you ever feel left out, this was the bitter like you no longer have a place, gratitude, or that your presence has lost its value. Remember, the shadows of our shared life always began to feel increasingly heavy. Those who sow in gratitude Emily would sigh loudly when I entered the kitchen, but sooner or later, my mere presence was disturbing. And those who wipe the table after I got up, sooner or later, insinuating that I was leaving a mess. I learned this she would say things like, speeches, "The house is too crowded," from experience, or "We need more space." I learned for the kids, that no matter how much they try to be sideways, no one can erase the truth. Each of these words, because like the small wounds, sooner or later, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to keeping the house afloat, when it does, was now treated as if she didn't belong. That's how I finally understood that I wasn't the one who needed to prove anything. But I just needed to show who really had the roots of that house. It was this silence that hurt what I did, because it was the greatest revelation with me. He saw, it's because this story spoke to you in some way, but he chose not to intervene. So I want to ask you one simple thing: that his decisions were no longer tied to the mother who raised until the end, but to the woman with whom he now shared his life until the last. This transformation in my own son creates an even more beautiful connection between us. Because I remember every word you day when Emily feel accompanied in this conversation. Your grandmother needs more rest. Your heart. She can't do much anymore. This helps keep this message alive and allows more people to find this space for reflection. It was as if she wanted to reinforce that I was no longer useful. And if you feel that stories like this make a difference in your life, by their side, subscribe to the channel. Some secluded corner. This way, you'll continue receiving content that, in some way, at me blankly, can bring inspiration, but I understood, courage, or simply the humiliation of not being disguised as care. And since you stuck around, this kind of disguise, there's a video is the cruelest that complements because you can't respond without seeming ungrateful. There. I felt surrounded by small rejections that, together, created a suffocating atmosphere. With every sidelong glance, every hushed phrase, I felt as if I was shrinking inside my own home. This is where loneliness begins, not when we're actually alone, but when we realize we're no longer seen. Have you ever felt this? Being physically present, but emotionally invisible? This invisibility gnawed at me. At night, lying in bed, I wondered when everything had changed. I'd always believed in the law of return, in the idea that those who sow love reap love. But it seemed my harvest was coldness and distance. Still, there was an instinct to resist. An inner voice that said, "Don't let this define you." The impact of these small humiliations began to build inside me, like a silent crack growing until the wall gives way. I didn't yet know how, but I sensed that this story was about to take an unexpected turn. Something inside me was preparing itself, even in silence. And it was precisely at this point that the atmosphere in the house began to shift completely, revealing that the discomfort wasn't temporary, but the beginning of something much bigger. For a few days, things seemed to have returned to normal. After so many unspoken words and silent glances, Michael appeared with a bouquet of flowers. I couldn't remember the last time he'd done something like that. It was as if, for a moment, the boy I'd raised was back. He handed me the flowers with a light smile, and I felt a knot loosen inside me. I looked at his face and thought, my son still loves me. That scene was like an unexpected bomb, a breath of hope amid the storm that had been gathering inside the house. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything I'd been feeling, Emily's comments, the heavy silences, the self-deprecating phrases, was simply the result of a misunderstanding, of fleeting tensions. I wanted to believe my family still saw me, that I still had a real place. It was as if a transformation was about to happen, a chance for a fresh start. Maybe I'd overreacted, I thought. Maybe my weary mind was seeing evil where none existed. This hopeful mindset sustained me for a few days. Michael seemed more attentive, asked if I needed anything, even made me my favorite tea one night. Emily also lessened her comments, or maybe I simply didn't notice them because I was busy rebuilding a sense of belonging within myself. There was a quiet vulnerability within me, an almost childlike desire to believe that, deep down, everything could still be the same. But life is sometimes cruel in showing us that apparent care can hide hidden truths. The following week, I went downstairs and saw something that made my heart freeze. My mattress was being carried toward the basement. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. My mind tried to deny what my eyes were seeing. But soon I realized. My room, the space I occupied within that house, was going to be given over to guests. The impact of that scene hit me with a devastating effect. It was as if all the flowers, all the tea, all the attention of the past few days were just part of a poorly rehearsed act, a way to soften the fall that was already being planned. This wasn't care, it was preparation. I was being slowly removed, displaced, as if my presence had become too uncomfortable to tolerate. The most painful thing wasn't the mattress coming down the stairs. It was the casual expression on their faces, as if it was simply a practical decision, without emotional weight. Michael didn't look me in the eye. Emily, on the other hand, seemed satisfied. There was a silent revelation there. I was no longer a central part of that family. I had become a detail, something that could be pushed backstage, away from the main stage of the house. As I watched my mattress disappear into the depths of the basement, I felt something inside me break. It was more than the loss of a room. It was the symbolic loss of my place in the family. I, who had built every piece of that story, was now displaced like a worthless piece. I didn't cry in front of them. I held back the tears, but inside, it felt like everything was falling apart. Have you ever been there? Feigning strength when you're actually falling apart inside? That night, I sat on the edge of the bed I'd already made in the basement. The air was damp, cold, and the silence was almost deafening. I thought about the entire journey I'd made to get there, all the decisions I'd made to get to this point. It was as if a hidden truth had finally revealed itself to me. I hadn't just lost a room, I'd lost recognition, dignity, the space I'd thought would last forever. Yet, within this silent vulnerability, a flame lingered. I didn't know when or how, but something inside me told me this story wouldn't end there. The mattress in the basement was just a sign of an even greater transformation to come, something that would change not only my position in that house, but the way everyone there would look at me from now on. The first day in the basement was like passing through an invisible door between two worlds. The one above, filled with voices, laughter, and hurried footsteps, and the one below, cold, damp, and silent, where time seemed to drag on like a punishment. I sat on that makeshift mattress, still with the musty smell rising from the walls, trying to convince myself it was temporary. But deep down I knew, it wasn't. When I heard Emily's voice, clear and firm, piercing the floor like a cruel sentence, my last illusions shattered. She's lived too long. Now it's our turn. Those were the words I heard, and each syllable seemed to push me deeper into that cramped space. I didn't cry out loud. My reaction was silent, as it had always been throughout my journey. I learned early on that contained tears carry more weight than those that fall with a noise. I lay on the mattress and let the tears flow, wetting the thin pillow, while I wondered at what point in my life I had lost the right to be seen as part of the family. It was as if every sacrifice had suddenly been erased, as if the years of work and sacrifice were nothing more than forgotten scenes in a play I was no longer a part of. The hardest part was hearing life go on as normal upstairs. Laughter during dinner, children's footsteps running, the sound of pots and pans banging. The house was alive, but that life no longer included me. The impact of this is indescribable. Being present, yet excluded. It's a humiliation that needs no words, because it reveals itself in silence, in isolation, in the absence of any gesture that confirms its importance. Have you ever experienced this? Being in the same physical space and, at the same time, being treated as if you didn't exist? In the middle of the night, I heard light footsteps coming down the stairs. It was Sarah, my granddaughter. She'd snuck into the basement, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. She carried a small flashlight in her hand and a small blanket trailing behind her. When she saw me lying there, she came over and asked, with the innocence only a child possesses, "Grandma, why do you live down here?" I got no answer. My throat closed, and I just stroked her hair, trying to smile to hide the pain. But that moment was an even greater shock than Emily's words. Because if even a child could see injustice, how could adults not? In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about me. What they were doing to me was also a silent lesson for Sarah and the other children in the house. They were seeing, learning, absorbing that a grandmother could be cast aside, discarded when she was no longer useful. This thought tore me apart. Because I knew the impact of this would go beyond my humiliation. It was a cruel transformation in how the value of an entire life would be viewed by future generations. The basement smelled abandoned, and every detail reinforced the sense of loss. The dampness seeping down the walls, the dim light barely illuminating the corners, the creaking of the stairs above me. Everything seemed to scream that I was out of place. But within that setting, a hidden truth began to silently form. No matter how hard they pushed me down, something inside me still resisted. There was a small, almost invisible flame that told me I couldn't let this be the last page of my story. I lay down every night with this mixture of pain and determination. Emily's words echoed. Now it's our turn. But a part of me wondered, really? Would it be that simple to erase a lifetime of dedication, love, and sacrifice? In the darkness of the basement, I began to reflect on the decisions that had brought me here. Every choice made out of love, every sacrifice hidden behind the scenes of Michael's life, all of it seemed to have lost its value. But I knew I wasn't defeated. The simple fact that I still felt pain was also proof that I was still alive, and where there's life, there's room for change. Sarah returned again and again, always in secret. She brought drawings, small hidden pieces of cake, sometimes just lying beside me to listen to my stories. And I saw something in her eyes that gave me strength, the certainty that, at least to her, I still mattered. This connection, however fragile, became my relief, because it reminded me that, however invisible I was to some, there was still someone who saw me for who I truly was. Each visit from Sarah ignited within me a reminder of what was at stake. I wasn't just a grandmother relegated to a forgotten corner. I was part of a larger story, a journey that wasn't yet over. And deep down, I felt that silent flame within me was growing, preparing the ground for something that would completely change the course of what seemed definitive. That night, lying on the damp mattress in the basement, I felt something inside me reach its breaking point. The silence around me was so heavy it seemed to crush me. I could hear, in the distance, the muffled voices coming from upstairs, Emily's laughter, Michael's conversations, the children's footsteps. It was as if two worlds were separated by an invisible barrier. Theirs, full of life and comfort, and mine, reduced to cold walls and a feeling of abandonment that hurt more than any physical wound. It was then that the hidden truth revealed itself to me. If I did nothing, if I agreed to stay in that basement, I would end up forgotten, like an object no one needed anymore, erased from my own family's history. The impact of that thought shot through me like an electric current. I was 72 years old, but within me there was still a flame that lingered. For the first time, I realized I needed to transform that pain into strength. I'd spent my entire life making decisions for others, putting aside my own desires so Michael could have opportunities. Now it was different. It was no longer about sacrifice, it was about survival. And in that moment, I realized I had reached the breaking point. The submissive mentality I'd carried for decades began to unravel. I wasn't just an old woman relegated to the basement. I was a woman with an entire story etched in my scarred hands, in every line of my face, in every memory of nights spent awake sewing to support a child. I carried behind-the-scenes stories no one knew about, revelations they might have forgotten, but which never ceased to exist. It was time to look at all of this not as a burden, but as power. I got up slowly that night, walked to the small, cracked mirror leaning against the wall, and stared at my own reflection. The wrinkles were there, yes, but so were the marks of resistance, of the quiet courage that had always accompanied me. My eyes, tired, still had a sparkle. It was as if I recognized myself again, as if a forgotten version of myself had returned to remind me who I was. As I reflected, I remembered a phrase I heard many years ago. What you don't learn through love, life teaches you through pain. And I realized that this was the moment when pain was teaching me something new. It wasn't just about enduring. It was about choosing. The revelation was clear. I could stay there, invisible, or I could turn the tables and show that my journey wasn't over yet. Sarah's visits came back to me. Her curious gaze, the innocent questions that pierced me like knives, the way she lay beside me just to be with me. I didn't want her to grow up believing that a grandmother's life ended in the basement. This responsibility gave me even more strength. I needed to be an example not only of sacrifice, but of transformation. I wanted her to look back and remember the grandmother who wouldn't let herself be erased. It was in this state of reflection that a decision began to form within me. It wasn't immediate, nor impulsive. It was like a seed, planted in the darkness, yet ready to germinate. I began to see every detail of my situation as part of a larger plan. The mattress in the basement wasn't the end of my journey, but the trigger for a new phase. And deep down, I knew I had more power than they imagined. As the night wore on, I thought about everything that was at stake. My dignity, my memory, my place in the family's history. And suddenly, I realized there was something within that very house that could change everything, something they might not even remember, but which I never forgot. It was as if fate had placed a hidden card in my hands, waiting just for the right moment to be revealed. I fell asleep late that night, but not with a broken heart. For the first time in a long time, I closed my eyes with a different feeling, that something was about to change. The pain remained, of course, but now it was a pain that pushed, that propelled me. I didn't yet know how I would act, but I knew I had taken the first step within myself. Vulnerability had turned into determination. And it was in that heavy silence of the basement that the flame of change began to grow. I wasn't just a victim. I still had a voice. I still had power. And when the time was right, I would show everyone that life can surprise even those who believe they've already won the game. As all these reflections ran through my head, I wondered how many other women, how many other grandparents, have felt this same sensation of being pushed aside, of having their stories reduced to almost nothing within their own homes. This hidden truth, which often no one has the courage to speak out loud, is precisely what hurts the most. Realizing that what seemed like unconditional love can turn into silence, indifference, and humiliation. I know I'm not the only one who has experienced something like this, and perhaps that's why I feel such a strong need to share this journey with you, who are listening now. And here I want to open a special space. If at any point in this story you felt touched, if something I said brought back a memory or even revolted you, leave here in the comments what touched your heart most. Your voice is important, not just to me, but to an entire community of people who carry similar pain and memories. When you write, share, or even vent, you're not just leaving a comment. You're helping to create a space where others can feel less alone. If this story has made you reflect on gratitude, choices, or even the decisions that shaped your own life, give this video a like. It may seem small, but each like helps this message spread further, reaching someone who might need to hear it right now. And if you feel this kind of content has a real impact, that it touches places not always spoken about openly, subscribe to the channel. This way, you can continue walking with me through these stories, while also ensuring that this voice doesn't get lost in the silence. Your participation here is what makes this space exist and grow. I don't tell these stories just for myself, but because I know there are thousands of Dorothys scattered around the world, each carrying their own stories of sacrifice, pain, and hidden strengths. And when you comment, when you say, "I understand you," or even, "That happened to me too," something powerful happens. It's not just a growing channel, it's an invisible support network that grows stronger with every word. So if anything you've heard so far has moved you, revolted you, moved you, or simply made you think, write, like, and subscribe. Because every gesture you make helps keep this message alive and opens the door for new revelations yet to come. And that night, as I clung to the resolve not to let myself go out, I understood that this silent flame within me would be the strength for what came next. Because, however deep the basement seemed, there was something greater about to emerge. What no one in the house knew was that, behind all the silence, I carried with me a truth that had never been spoken aloud. For years, I guarded this secret like one guarding a sacred memory, believing I would never need to use it as a defense. I always believed that love and gratitude would be enough to maintain harmony, and so I never felt the need to reveal what was hidden behind the scenes of our story. But at that time, when I had already found myself reduced to the basement, when I heard from Emily that I had already lived too much, and that now it was their turn, I understood it was time to open the curtains and let the revelation come to light. The truth is that that house, every wall, every door, every brick, was in my name from the beginning. It was the only legacy my husband left when he passed, and I cared for that home with all my strength so that Michael would have a safe place to grow up. It never occurred to me to use this information against them, because I believed, with all my heart, that it wouldn't be necessary. My belief was simple. Those raised with love learn to return love with love. I believed that the foundation of everything was trust, that I would never need papers or documents to remind my own family of the value of my existence. But now, every detail I had hidden became a silent weapon. Keeping this secret had previously seemed like a generous choice. Now, I realized it had become a key. As I lay in the basement and recalled Sarah's visits, her curious eyes and innocent questions, I felt deep inside that I could no longer remain silent. The impact of those words, "She's lived too long," left no room for doubt. It was as if life had placed me at a crossroads. Continue to be a shadow of myself, or use the truth that had always been with me to turn the story upside down. I began to mentally revisit the entire journey that had brought me there. The decisions made, the sacrifices hidden behind the scenes, the sacrifices that were never seen. And I realized that, in silence, I had built more than a life of struggle. I had built a power they didn't know about. The secret wasn't just a document tucked away in a drawer. It was proof that my voice still mattered, that my story still had an impact, that I wasn't disposable. This revelation, which I had always treated as a detail, was transforming before my eyes into a weapon of justice. There was a mixture of pain and anticipation within me. I knew the time to speak was approaching, but I also sensed the vulnerability of someone who had always lived to serve, and now needed to shift my mindset and take a different stance. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I simply wanted to reclaim my dignity, to show that an entire life can't be erased with a cruel sentence. The weight of the secret stayed with me night after night, until it became impossible to carry it inside myself. I remembered my husband's words from when he was still alive. He'd say, "Dorothy, don't give everything away without keeping something that's yours alone. One day you might need it." For years, I ignored this advice because I believed in the power of gratitude. But there, in the basement, I realized this was the revelation that could change everything. And suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Michael's flowers, Emily's silence, the indifference in their eyes. It all seemed part of a plot that was pushing me out of my own house. But what they didn't know is that the house had never stopped being mine. This awareness brought with it a silent transformation. I no longer felt like a mere victim. A new strength surged within me, almost like an awakening. The secret I'd kept for so long began to pulse within me like a reminder. I still had the power to choose the course of this story. And with each passing day, the certainty grew. I would no longer be just the grandmother forgotten in the basement, but the woman who held the key to that entire house in her hands. And that's how I realized that fate had given me a rare opportunity to transform years of silence into a voice, and to make this revelation the starting point for something much greater than I could have imagined. I knew there was still a way to go, but deep down, I felt I was facing a moment that would change everything. Not just for me, but for every single person in that family who thought they had already won the game. The next morning, I woke up different. The same damp mattress, the same mold-stained walls, the same basement cold. But something inside me had shifted. The decision that had previously existed only as an idea now pulsed through my veins like an unshakable certainty. It was as if all the voices from the past, my husband's, my own conscience, even the echoes of the sacrifices I'd made throughout my life, had united to remind me that now was the time to act. There was no longer room for hesitation. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the creak of the wood beneath my feet. Each step seemed to carry not only my physical weight, but my entire journey. When I reached the living room, I saw Emily organizing some things and Michael sitting at the table, distracted, while Sarah played in the corner. There was an air of normalcy in the scene, as if nothing had happened. But I knew I was about to shatter that false harmony with a revelation that would change everything. I called everyone to sit down. My voice was firm, but inside, my heart was pounding. I looked each of them in the eye and placed the documents on the table. papers yellowed with age, but still filled with power. "Before anything," I began, "I need everyone to hear what I have to say." The silence that fell was almost sacred. Emily crossed her arms, suspicious. Michael avoided my gaze. Sarah simply watched me with that innocence that so often gave me the strength to carry on. I took a deep breath and said, "If anyone's going to leave this house, it's not me." Those words came out of me like a thunderbolt, firm and uncompromising. Emily frowned, pale, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Michael, on the other hand, began to cry. His tears fell not just from shock, but because, deep down, he knew the truth. And Sarah, my sweet granddaughter, ran to hug me, as if she understood something much bigger was happening. I revealed that the house had always been in my name. I told her I'd kept this secret because I believed in gratitude, because I thought I'd never have to prove myself to my own family. But now, after everything that had happened, it was inevitable. I needed to show that dignity isn't something that can be taken away with words or humiliation. The impact was immediate. Emily was speechless. The confidence with which she'd always spoken, the arrogance with which she'd always treated me, vanished before my eyes. It was as if I'd been blindsided by a hidden truth I'd never considered. Michael, still in tears, stammered apologies. I saw on his face not only regret, but also shame. Shame for having bowed his head so many times, shame for having allowed his mother to be pushed into a basement, shame for not having honored the behind-the-scenes story of the entire journey that had brought him here. The revelation weighed on him like a burden. And I knew that this moment, more than any other, would be remembered forever. Sarah squeezed my arm and said softly, "I knew you shouldn't stay down there, Grandma." These simple words, coming from a child's mouth, were like divine confirmation that I was doing the right thing. It was as if the law of return, that invisible justice that time always brings, had finally manifested itself. Life had placed me in the basement, but it also gave me the chance to show that nothing goes unpunished, that everything that is done returns, sooner or later. As I spoke, I realized my voice was no longer trembling. There was a strength within me I hadn't even known until that moment. It was as if I'd waited a lifetime to say those words. And in saying them, I wasn't just defending my right to remain in that house. I was defending my husband's memory, the years of work, the sleepless nights, every hidden tear. I was defending the history I'd built with my own hands. Emily tried to react, but her voice faltered. She had no more arguments, no more control. Her mindset that she could push me out of her own house crumbled in the face of this undeniable revelation. Michael remained silent, crying, and that silence spoke louder than any words. It was a belated acknowledgement that I had allowed the injustice to happen, but it was also the first time in a long time that I felt he truly saw me. The room felt charged with something greater, as if the very air had shifted. That moment wasn't just a family reckoning. It was a spiritual transformation, a revelation that showed that truth always finds its way. I felt that somehow I wasn't alone in that room. It was as if my husband's presence was with me, as if all the years of silence and pain had gathered to sustain my voice. And when I finished speaking, I looked at each of them and realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The balance of that house had shifted. Power had shifted, not because of the document itself, but because I had finally shown that my story could not be erased. What they had tried to hide in the basement was now exposed to the light. And although the battle wasn't over yet, in that moment I knew the course of the journey was about to change in a way no one there could have foreseen. After that day the truth came out. The house was never the same. Not just because of the words I spoke, but because of the silent transformation that spread throughout the walls, as if every corner had heard and absorbed the impact of the revelation. It was at that moment that I understood that my journey didn't have to end in the basement. I still had the strength to rewrite my own story, no longer as someone invisible, but as the protagonist of the life I fought so hard to sustain. The first decision I made was to reclaim my space. My room, the one that had been so cruelly ripped from me, was mine again. But I didn't want to simply re-enter it, like someone reclaiming a lost place. I wanted to renew it, give it new meaning. I decided to renovate it myself, applying the same dedication I'd always put into my son's life to every detail. I chose cheerful colors and fabrics reminiscent of my sewing creations, and little by little, the space that had been marked by grief transformed into a haven of peace and dignity. This choice wasn't just aesthetic, it was a symbolic gesture, an act of rebuilding my mindset. As I moved the furniture and adjusted the curtains, I thought about how many times I'd sacrificed my own comfort for the sake of others. And now, for the first time in many years, I realized that caring for myself was also a form of love. Not just for myself, but for everyone I lived with. Because a home that breathes joy can only be built when each person within it feels valued. But I knew I didn't want to stop there. The revelation that brought back my space also rekindled an old flame within me, the joy of sewing. For years, it was the tool that allowed me to navigate life's backstage with dignity, albeit in silence. I decided to transform this skill, which had so often sustained me through difficult times, into something greater. I set up a small studio in the backyard, simple but full of meaning. I placed my sewing machine near the window, arranged shelves with colorful fabrics, and created a space where I could not only work but also share what I knew. Soon, neighbors began to show up. Some came out of curiosity, others because they needed their old clothes altered. But what surprised me most was realizing how many of them, women of all ages, were looking for more than sewing. They came looking for conversation, advice, a space where they could feel heard. And there, between needles and thread, we began to weave together not just clothes, but stories, secrets, life revelations. It was as if the studio had become a meeting place, a space for collective transformation. Sarah also started spending more time with me. After school, she'd come running into the backyard, scatter crayons on the table, and sit there, drawing while I sewed. Sometimes she'd ask to learn simple stitches, and I'd teach her patiently, remembering how I'd taught Michael so many things when he was little. The difference was that now I no longer carried just the responsibility of providing for them, but the joy of passing on something valuable, part of my legacy. Seeing the sparkle in Sarah's eyes when I finished a small, but painstakingly made, stitch showed me that this new beginning was also a way of planting seeds in her heart. This new phase didn't erase the pain of the past, but transformed it. Every humiliation I suffered, every tear I shed in silence, now became fuel for something greater. I realized that life doesn't just give us falls, but also opportunities to rise stronger. The impact of that decision to reveal the truth went far beyond defending my dignity. It was an invitation to redefine my own existence. And the more I dedicated myself to the studio, the more I felt the surrounding community was also touched. Some women said, "Dorothy, here I feel alive again." Others simply remained silent, with a look that said more than any words. And I realized that, by making space for them, I was also healing wounds that were not just mine. The journey that began in solitude now expanded in company. Michael remained silent, slowly trying to repair the damage caused by his choices. It wasn't easy for him, I knew. The shame still weighed heavily. But I also understood that transformation is a process, and that every decision he made from then on would be viewed differently. Emily, on the other hand, seemed more distant, as if she still didn't know how to deal with the role reversal. But that didn't matter to me as much as it once did. I had understood that the value of a life doesn't depend on everyone's recognition, but on the courage to look in the mirror and know that it hasn't been erased. And so, amidst fabrics, threads, and shared stories, I began to find a new way of living. Not as someone forgotten in the basement, but as a woman who rose again, who transformed her pain into something tangible, who ceased to be a shadow and became a presence once again. For the first time in many years, I felt useful, valued, and above all, truly alive. But deep down I knew, this wasn't the end of the story. Because every new beginning brings with it new challenges, new revelations, and I felt that sooner or later, life would put this newfound strength I had acquired to the test. As time passed, I realized that the true transformation wasn't just about reclaiming my room or opening my studio. The most profound change happened within me. I was no longer the same woman who silently accepted every harsh word, every gesture of indifference. Something within me had awakened, And now I could clearly see what had previously seemed shrouded in silence. It was as if a hidden truth had finally surfaced. The value of a life doesn't depend on the gaze of others, but on the courage to stand up to injustice. Looking back made me understand that the entire journey, from the moment I was pushed into the basement to the revelation of the documents, had not been merely a punishment or a humiliation. It was a kind of polishing. The pain shaped me, and it was in this process that I found the strength to rise again. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to fight, I didn't need to debase myself. All I did was show the truth. And the truth, when it appears, has the power to silence even the most arrogant voices. Emily no longer looked at me the same way. The impact of that morning when I'd laid the papers on the table was still present in her every gesture. There was a mixture of discomfort and helplessness, as if she'd lost control of the narrative she'd tried to impose for so long. Michael, for his part, was slowly trying to get closer. The tears he shed on the day of the revelation were not just of surprise, but of regret. And while it was still difficult for him to face everything he'd allowed to happen, I knew the experience had left deep scars. It was as if he were faced with a new opportunity to rethink his own decisions, to rebuild his relationship with the mother who raised him. Sarah continued to be my greatest source of joy. Every hug from her, every drawing she proudly showed me, was living proof that even amidst wounds, there's always room to plant something new. Teaching her small sewing stitches, hearing her laughter as she played in the yard, made me feel that the legacy I would leave behind would not be one of pain, but of dignity and love. And as I observed all this, I understood a lesson that became the guiding thread of my new mindset. No one can erase a story built with true sacrifice. People can try to hide it, manipulate it, even push it into oblivion. But there are things that endure, that take root so deeply that they become unbreakable. My life, with all its behind-the-scenes sacrifice and struggle, was among these things. I also realized that the law of return never fails. Those who sow ingratitude inevitably reap loneliness. This was evident in Emily, who, despite having achieved the space she so desperately desired, seemed increasingly isolated within her own home. Her victory was an illusion, because there is no true victory when it stems from injustice. And those who sow love and dignity, on the other hand, reap respect. This respect isn't immediate, it's not always visible to the eye, but it arrives. It arrives in the form of silent recognition, small changes in looks, hugs that carry regret. My life has taught me that power lies not in domination, but in permanence. Staying true to who you are, to your roots, to what you've built with so much effort. I didn't need to raise my voice to prove anything. I simply demonstrated calmly and firmly that the roots of that house were always mine. And when someone tries to tear up such deep roots, all they achieve is to discover their own fragility. This understanding brought me a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Today, every morning I wake up in my renovated bedroom, every afternoon I spend sewing in my studio, every moment with Sarah. All of this reminds me that life, however cruel it may seem, also offers new beginnings. But these new beginnings only exist when we choose not to let ourselves be erased. And that's why, if you ever feel left out, if you feel like you no longer have a place, or that your presence has lost its value, remember, life always exacts what's due. Those who sow ingratitude may even smile for a while, but sooner or later, emptiness sets in. And those who sow love and dignity, sooner or later, reap respect. I learned this not from fancy speeches, but from experience. I learned that no matter how much they try to demean you, no one can erase the truth. Because the truth, sooner or later, always finds a way to emerge. And when it does, everything changes. That's how I finally understood that I wasn't the one who needed to prove anything. I just needed to show who really had the roots of that house. And that's exactly what I did. And if you've made it this far with me, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So I want to ask you one simple thing. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know who truly walked with me until the last stretch of this journey. This creates an even more beautiful connection between us, because I read every word you leave here and feel accompanied in this conversation. If this video touched your heart, please like it. This helps keep this message alive and allows more people to find this space for reflection and strength. And if you feel that stories like this make a difference in your life, subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll continue receiving content that, in some way, can bring inspiration, courage, or simply the feeling of not being alone. And since you stuck around, there's a video here that complements this topic. Click and follow me there.